Good morning, everyone. So my name is Jill Scott, and I'm Vice-Provost Teaching and Learning here at Queen's. And today, Teaching Development Day, is one of my absolute favorite days. So I'm thrilled to have all of you here, and my job this morning is to facilitate this fabulous panel of faculty that we have here. And my notes just disappeared. Great, thank you. Okay, so how many people are teaching for the first time this year? Okay, and how many of those people are nervous? Okay, now my next question is, how many people have taught for many years? And how many of you, those people teaching for many years, are nervous? Okay, this is in my experience something that never ever goes away. I'm not teaching this semester, and yet I'm having those very same feelings. They don't go away when it starts to be the end of August, the beginning of September. I get the butterflies, and sometimes I even have those teacher dreams, even if I'm not actually going to stand in front of the classroom next week. So tomorrow is the first day of classes, and so here we are. And I think what better way to work through some of those nerves than to be here at Teaching Development Day. So we think very often about our students as learners. That's a pretty clear idea for us. But I think today is actually about teachers as learners. And that's one of the wonderful things about being a teacher is we get to continually be learners. So I think in some ways, one of the best ways to learn is, in fact, to teach. We never, ever learn things the same way unless we're teaching. But it's also fantastic to remember that it's about the learning and not always and only about the teaching. So one of the things that I had to learn when I was a beginning teacher is, in fact, not to hide behind all of my notes, not to hide behind a lectern, not to hide behind my insecurities and uncertainties, but to really understand that if I wanted my students to fully engage and make themselves vulnerable in their learning, that I need to do the very same thing. And so we have a panel here of fabulous instructors, and each of them, we have a trio in the middle here, and I'm going to just, the way we're going to do this, I'm going to introduce everybody all at once, and then we have 7 slides, 7 minutes for each of the groups or the courses that are going to be discussed, and then there will be some time for engagement and discussion and for you to think about what undisciplining means in your context. So I'm going to start with Val Michaelson, who's sitting right here. Val is a postdoctoral fellow, cross-appointed between the School of Religious Studies and Public Health Sciences. Her work is at the intersection of childhood studies, religious studies, and health research. And integrating religious studies and health research isn't a new idea, she says. The word health is rooted in the words whole and holy, and many ancient cultures and religious traditions are rooted in beliefs around human beings as holistic, integrated beings. And I was excited to hear how Val described her passion for her work around troubling public health problems that have a religious aspect that no one wants to touch. So pretty exciting stuff there. She's going to be talking about one of the courses she's taught, which is religion in childhood. Next, we have, I'm just trying to, I've got, sorry, I've got the wrong order here from my notes, but so Claire Davies, Suzanne Murphy, and Catherine Donnelly. So I'll introduce them each a little bit individually. So Claire Davies teaches in the Department of Mechanical Materials Engineering in Engineering and Applied Science. Her research lab is called Building and Designing Assistive Technology, and most of her work is interdisciplinary, seeks to combine input from both engineers and clinicians. Suzanne Murphy's primary teaching responsibilities include fieldwork and fieldwork preparation. Her research interests include health policy, clinical fieldwork, interprofessional education, and collaborative practice. And Catherine Donnelly teaches in both occupational health and aging and health programs, and her clinical interest is in team-based primary care, and her educational research is focused on interdisciplinary education. And they're going to be talking about a course that they teach together. I was pretty excited to hear about how this came together. They said it was 10 years in the making to get this particular iteration of this course together. And that it was really the glue was a graduate student who was working both in engineering and occupational therapy. So we'll be excited to hear about that course. And then, last but not least, Dr. Mark Hostetler teaches in the Department of Global Development Studies, and his interests are in contributing to alternative approaches to sustainability research rooted in local, social, political, and economic realities that contribute to moving toward more sustainable local livelihoods. And the course he's going to speak about is Devs 330, Technology in Development. And I asked Mark if there was an exciting story about how this got going, and he said, actually it was the instructor previous left, and he was given the course. So I'm sure there's exciting stories that we want to hear there. So without further ado, do we want to go just to... Okay, you guys are going to start? Yeah. Okay, awesome. Okay, so take it away.
When it's behind you, it's tricky. So we're here to talk about a collaboration between occupational therapy. We're here to talk about a collaboration between occupational therapy and engineering. So, okay, good. It's all going. So just wanted to talk a little bit about the foundation of the course. If anyone doesn't know about assistive technology, our devices are products that help people to perform the activities they need or want to do. So typically assistive devices are for people with disabilities or who are aging. They can be high, anywhere from robotics to low-tech, a can opener. What we know from the literature, though, is that approximately half of these devices that people purchase or are recommended aren't actually used. And from an occupational therapy perspective, we are typically the profession that looks at recommending or prescribing the devices, and engineering typically is the developers of the devices. So how do we solve a problem which we know is out there in the real world? It's a complex problem we know is both individual and environmental in nature. So what we thought we'd do is bring multiple disciplines together in an education setting. So we actually brought groups of occupational therapy and engineering students paired with older adults from the community, and they worked over a 6-week course and identified a real problem that each individual was having and developed an assistive device, which you'll see some actual real ones up on the screen behind me. So a lot of people will be talking about potentially teaching approaches, but what we've decided to tackle is to talk to you about assessment. And so some of the biggest assessments and the problem, how am I going to be marked, which you will all face soon. And so really, how do we think about assessing sort of undisciplined teaching from multiple perspectives, looking at professions that have their own unique competency frameworks that we are working towards. And so with that in mind, we're thinking about how do we assess specific, unique professional competencies, but how do we also assess common competencies that we know that overlap between both engineering and occupational therapy. And so things like collaboration, communication. So we identified a framework actually from the health science literature that looks at actually competencies of collaboration. So that was with that in mind that helped us look at our assessments. So I'm going to talk to you about a few general points about assessment. I'm going to hand it over to Claire Davies, who's going to talk about specific assessments that we used in the course. So for everyone here, and many of you are new to the teaching world, thinking about assessments when you have multiple disciplines. And this was a unique course in the sense that these students were working together, but are actually enrolled in separate courses. So the key is when you're doing something like this, and I've learned the hard way and over many years of doing interprofessional education, is that you need assessments that bring people together. They have to believe they're being evaluated simultaneously and in an important way. So thinking about competencies of both disciplines in your assessments. and also considered common competencies. And for us, that was communication and collaboration, and using frameworks that help you to identify what those look like. So from a marker that you can actually look at and identify elements that you're looking specifically to evaluate. Also considering for instructors here, including and hiring TAs that have perspectives from multiple fields specifically, and making sure that you build in time for the TAs to get to know each other. So learning about other perspectives before you actually go to mark is critical, because you will learn, as Jill was saying, an immense amount from your colleagues who come from a different background. And making sure, if you can, actually have them work together. So not just simultaneously take their assignments and mark separately, but actually sitting in the same room. And lastly, just talking about equal weighting. So making sure that each perspective is equally weighted and also weighted in the course amounts. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Claire.
We share everything. So combined assessments. Can you flick it? Thank you. So we had 3 different combined assessments within this course. Poster presentation on the last day of classes. Those are things that people understand work together. One person does 3 minutes, each person does an individual minute, they can be in whatever discipline they are, and they can speak to that specific topic. Unfortunately though, that is where the limit is exceeded. That is where they understand, yes, I can do both of these things, I can be assessed together, and group work works really well with posters and presentations. The trouble is when you start to integrate other types of assessment into the course itself. So for instance, we do this parallel design, which is the first iteration of a design. Now, as Catherine was saying, we are designing technology for older individuals. Parallel design requires that each member of the team actually produces some sort of sketch of the design. And so you'll get occupational therapists and you'll get engineers giving completely different ideas, and the idea is to be able to integrate those together. So one assignment is that they actually have to submit 10 PowerPoint slides in which they've given all of their examples to us and suggested the pros and cons of each. The important thing is they have to focus on the pros, not the cons, because of course, different people have different opinions about what their colleagues have actually produced. And so one of the hardest things that we found to actually evaluate is this parallel design process. So the first year, what we actually did is we had independent assessments. And the occupational therapy TA marked that, and the engineering TA marked the other. Then we went on to having combined assessment. Now, the problem with our combined assessment is that the OT passing grade is a 70%, the engineering passing grade is a 50%. And that makes things a little bit more complicated. So we did this first assessment, and primarily engineering TAs did the marking, and all of a sudden half the OTs failed. That was not a good scenario. So this year we're actually trying to look at it in a bit more interesting light and trying to combine the two together. Now you can see here, these are just some comments from my USATs. Do not have combined marks because the group does not, because one group does all the work and the amount of the other group is not considered. So of course engineers are commenting about occupational therapists in this particular situation because I'm the engineering prof. Differing marks between engineers and OTs is not fair as equal work is put in. So they're looking at it and they're saying, we shouldn't be evaluated equally. So as a trial for this year, what we're actually going to do is we're going to do an ungraded, but feedback provided to their actual assignments. So this year we're going to say, did not meet, just met, and exceeds expectations for this course. And hopefully in this manner, they will get the input and the feedback, but won't actually have a mark associated with it. However, we'll see how this goes and we'll work it on for the next iteration next year. The most important thing in this assessment process is that the teaching assistants have to work together on this assignment, is that they have to actually sit together in the same room and work through each assignment as a team. The other thing is that in the future, we'll continue just having the posters and the presentations graded together because that seems to be working. It's just the other assignment that we're still having troubles with, and I'm definitely open to any other ideas if you have any. Thanks.
The clicker.
Sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about a course that's similar in design in some ways to what you're doing, without the multiple professor kind of input from different directions. Jill mentioned that the way I got this course to begin with was sort of just a convenience, let's say. Convenient for me anyway. But at the same time, I did take it on in a way that was kind of unique in that I was working with a grad student at the time in engineering and had talked with him a lot, and he was an engineering grad student who was very interested in social science and in development studies in particular. So he had the disciplinary engineering chops, but he also wanted to integrate the other, and so we talked a lot about how to develop a course. The course had existed, but in a very different format from the way I put it together. So we talked about how to integrate the two things, right? How to integrate applied science kinds of approaches to things with social science kinds of approaches to things. So the course I teach is split between applied science students and global development studies students. The ratio fluctuates. Ideally, it would be half and half, but what it usually ends up being is about 30%, 40% engineers and 60% applied or social science students, largely development studies students. And it's largely based on group work in which the two groups are forced to work together on a project in a similar manner to what yours is. That sort of leads to all kinds of tensions. It leads to all kinds of discussion and a realization, I guess I would say, about how we think differently, how we work differently on problems. And one of the first things I do, and what I'm largely going to talk to you about today, is an exercise I do near the beginning of the course that helps to illustrate that. So what I do is So I divide the students into groups. I put 4 or 5 students from one of the disciplines in the group, and I have 2 students from the other discipline watch them with this small assignment. And so there'll be 5 or 6 different groups around the room that are working on what I give them. And then the observer group is supposed to sort of report back. What did they see? What's different than what they would normally do? What surprised them? That sort of thing. And so this is what I give them. An old-looking pail with hand turning on the water, old-looking tap, and I asked them to discuss what this means in terms of development. What does the picture represent? What are the challenges that it represents? And how would you go about addressing these challenges? Right? And so the groups from applied science sort of tackle it, and the groups from art science, sort of development studies, tackle this. And they come up with their solutions, and I give them, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, something like that. This sort of, there's, as you can imagine, there's some interesting results that come from this. I think it changes over the years because I think word gets out that this is coming, maybe. So I need to adjust sometimes, I think. But you see differences in assumptions, right? First question, is this a problem, right? Is this actually a problem? Is there a problem here? Where is it, right? There's assumptions being made about where this is, and some people question that and some people don't. The idea that comes out of applied science often is if you fix the tap, you fix the problem, right? Whereas often out of social science and development studies in particular, the idea that if you fix the underlying socioeconomic and political forces that work here, you can fix the problem. So those are very different things coming out of this, right? Questions come up, is this a technical problem with the tap or the water source? Is it an environmental issue related to climate change? Is it a global issue related to distribution of resources? Is it a gendered issue? Is this something that has to do with gender? Who has to go get water, that sort of thing? Is it an issue of access, actually, right? So there's differences in the way people define the problem. And it's not strictly disciplinary when the answers come out, because oftentimes in the course, what I find is people have self-selected into the course out of applied science in particular who are interested in this, who are engineers without borders folks sort of thing. So they have, they often have a sense of some of the things that will come up, some of them, and others not as much. There's also a difference in the analysis, in the way people analyze things, and in the solutions that they come up with. So for applied science students, you often get a real focus on the technical problem. People actually start calculating the likely flow rates of that pipe. They look at the way the tap is, and they think, well, that probably needs to be replaced because it's leaking. What type of well is that coming from? Is that the most sensible thing, right? And they often come up with sort of linear solutions to improve the water source and infrastructure, right? So they often come up with, in the 15 minutes they have, a very linear approach to solving this particular problem in a very mechanical kind of way. And the global development studies students, they come up with political solutions related to distribution and access. They come up with concerns about unintended impacts of maybe changing what this is, right? Maybe there's a social structure built around walking to this tap in the morning and taking and getting your water. So there's concern with the unintended impacts. There's also tends to be no plan. There's just a lot of talk. Well, this is a real big problem, right? So outcome for the students, ideally, there's a realization that both groups have very different starting points and headspaces about how they analyze a problem, how they talk about a problem, how they go about trying to solve a problem. There's a realization that there's biases and assumptions that they have about what's going on. There's a sense that the process of analysis, and work strategies that they have are different from each other. There is ideally an appreciation that the other group is bringing something here that is important in actually solving the problem. And hopefully a realization that collaboration will lead to something more useful overall. So that's the sort of intro assignment that sets them up to do group work and maybe sets expectations about what to expect from other people. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, well, that was a quick change. I am constantly told that I am the first one to have this appointment between public health sciences and the School of Religion. And people say, what? Like, that makes no sense. So I get this kind of response, like, what do you actually do? And then I start to explain, and within minutes, almost every person has a troubling story of, oh yeah, now this happened to me, or you should look at this, and people have all kinds of ideas of what I could do. Most of my research right now is on the corporal punishment of children. So I'll show you how this works. What we know from research is that evidence alone doesn't change people's behaviors, and I'm talking about this from the perspective of health. We have to start with people's values and attitudes. So this is an important strategy from my work because many attitudes that support the idea that some forms of violence against children are not only normal but justifiable are deeply ingrained in people's religious beliefs and values. Some of you might be familiar with this quote or this kind of thinking, often translated, spare the rod, spoil the child, and it's rooted in Christianity, though there are other places we trace this as well. And this is one of the ideas that has fueled this practice being legal in Canada. And so while over 60 countries around the world have made it illegal to hit children in the name of discipline, Canada's not one of them. So I am working on trying to change that by combining public health evidence and religious messaging to promote the well-being of children. So trying to untangle some of that. Even after I explain what we do, people say, oh, so you do public health half the week and religious studies the other half? And I say, no, I don't. I'm actually right in the middle, and I love this idea of conversations on the edge. That tends to be where I sit. I'm trying to look at things that nobody wants to talk about because they're too religious. But actually, we have to talk about them if we're going to untangle them a bit and try to solve them again for the well-being of children in particular. And it's highly collaborative, and it is a lot of fun. But being in the health sciences and the humanities is very exciting, but it's not without complexity methodologically and in terms of approaches. And often you can be looking at the same broad topic, but how you approach it is so different. So here's one example. The sciences can tell you how to clone a dinosaur. The humanities can tell you why it might be a bad idea. but for my work, public health provides the evidence. It shows us why corporal punishment puts children at risk for all kinds of adverse health outcomes. And the evidence is just very, very strong in this area. And public health also gives us strategies for disciplining children in a way that promotes their well-being. And religious studies helps us understand the values that underlie using this practice, and also helps us reframe religious reasons that support people doing this differently, again, for the well-being of kids. So both disciplines hold really important pieces of solving this really complex problem. Give you another, I thought, kind of funny example. Another of my projects is looking at spirituality and mental health in kids. And I had exactly the same presentation this summer at a conference. 20-minute presentation, 20 minutes of questions. I presented it in public health. 100% of the questions were about my methods. What was your sampling strategy? How did you collect your data? What were your coding and analysis strategies? Really, really important questions. Presented it 2 weeks later at a humanities conference, exactly the same presentation, 0 questions about my methods, all about the theoretical framework and what this means. So I do not want to fuel this incomplete stereotype that humanities goes deep and their theory is better and public health is more religious, rigorous methods. That's just untrue. So many of my colleagues are in both disciplines are amazing in both areas. But it is true that we have very different starting points and methods, and that's, I think, part of the fun. So this is so core to my research that when I teach, it just actually comes in pretty organically. And until Sue invited me to do this, I thought, well, I don't really do anything special. It's just really simple. It's because it's how I approach all of my research anyway. But I'll tell you about an elective I teach called Religion and Childhood. I have a lot more freedom than you do because it's an elective course. So we thought we'd use that as an example. Just because of the freedom. I have people just second year, so there aren't the kind of requirements that you might have to cover. People from education who are hoping to go into law, from social work, from engineering, from health sciences, from all over take this course. And so the way I undiscipline is actually invite the students to bring in their own interests, their own disciplinary trajectories into the course. And it gets really exciting. One of the projects that I do is have the students do a project on corporal punishment. And because I know a lot about it already, it's actually really easy for me to assess, because no matter what perspective they're bringing, I know enough about it to be able to assess it. So I just throw it wide open. Students from education want to look at corporal punishment in the context of separate schools or in public schools. People want to look at it as an Indigenous issue because it's part of the TRC calls to action to repeal the corporal punishment law. People want to look at it from development or all kinds of places. So students really get into this, and then we have presentations, and in a class of 60 people with 6 or 7 presentations, they're all different, all looking at religion and childhood and corporal punishment. And so that's really fun. And I can give students even more freedom in their papers. So religion and childhood and Harry Potter and circumcision and the law, religious objections to the HPV vaccine in schools, yoga in public schools. And so I find it really exciting to be pursuing this as well. So the students actually do the undisciplining for me, and I am very grateful to them for that because it just enriches me as a researcher. So thank you.
So thank you. We've had three really compelling presentations that have given us lots to think about. So what I'd like you to do now is turn to the person or the persons around you and just have a quick conversation about what you heard, the ways in which this has stimulated your thinking about undisciplining, and then I'll pull you back together and we'll have a discussion. So this is the danger of group work. Group work is super fun, and group work also is hard to stop. That's the good news. So now that you've had a chance to think about some questions, I have here the handy-dandy Queen's roaming microphone, if I can grab hold of it. And so if you have a question, just put up your hand and we'll get this to you. This is the Murph ball microphone. Yeah, okay, so back there. Great. Well, I'll throw it in that direction and somebody else will grab it and keep throwing it back.
Give me a second. Is this thing on? Okay. So for those of us from a very rigid educational background, very engineering-based educational background, how can we try and humanize that material a bit more?
Well, so I'll speak on behalf of Building Better Together, I guess, in terms of humanizing. And I think one of the biggest components that has been really important to us is bringing in members of the community. So those people who come in with real life challenges have really changed how things play out for the students, as well as the individual who comes in from the community. I think for the engineering students, we hear things from them like, well, this is the first time we've ever got to see how the kinds of things we can design will make things better for an individual living in the community. And so I think that really has an impact from our perspective.
I think there's two things. I think as I understand it, some of your core courses are trying to integrate a lot more of that recently at the undergrad level, right? Trying to include that. And the other thing is take our courses.
Okay, so other questions? All right, so we're going to try to get that. Actually, I'll just...
I've been teaching for a long time and have recently TA'd at another university. One of the issues I ran into was around assessment and being provided with rubrics that made it almost impossible for the students to succeed. And I'm wondering how you would suggest navigating that with your professor, in that there is multiple items in one assessment area that it was just difficult to mark them accordingly, or in a way that was meaningful, I guess, because we talked about meaningful assessment.
So, I mean, I think that it's collaborative conversations in terms of what the outcomes are and what the expectations are. I think that for students, I think that you hit on a point that it has to be. They have to be able to see how they can achieve different components within the assessment. I mean, one of the things that we've been using almost exclusively in the occupational therapy program is the ICE framework, ideas, connections, and extensions. And I think the Center for Teaching and Learning has had a big part in helping the OT program structure our assessment related to the ICE framework. I don't know if others have input into that question?
I hadn't planned to talk about this, but I think because I often teach the earlier undergraduate courses, there's a lot of anxiety around assessment from the students. And when I give them a presentation, I see part of my role is to teach them the course material, but also to set them up to make presentations, just how to make a good presentation. And so I will give a presentation to them that presents course material. So it's kind of, I'm teaching them how to give a presentation in the way I want them to do their presentation. I'm also giving them course content, but then I give them the rubric so they can mark me with my rubric, and then it gives us a chance to talk about the rubric, and they'll get a sense of what I'm looking for. So it actually has been a really effective way of getting them comfortable with the rubric and how I'll be assessing them. So you might find that a useful strategy.
Okay, one more question? Okay, so I'm going to toss this.
So this one's directed more towards Professor Davies, and I wondered if you could elaborate a little more on if you've referred to any literature for the problem you're tackling with your course, where you have two students with different grades that they have to meet, and how you might tackle that with marking, but only one mark might be attached to that project.
Yeah, good question. Actually, to be honest, I haven't looked at a whole lot of literature in that area, mainly because I don't know that very much exists. We have looked around for different things, but the concept of having two different grading structures in its entirety is fairly unique. And so what we're intending to do is get our information out there and take it from there. We are using things like the interprofessional learning survey and the readiness for interprofessional learning to get an idea of what sort of backgrounds the students do have. And then they complete those surveys again at the end of the course. So we try and understand whether or not they have succeeded in the interdisciplinary aspect of it. Admittedly, I actually taught a similar course at the University of Auckland for 9 years. And what we did there is we never actually gave marks. We only gave the meets expectations. There were 4 categories: meets, exceeds, or super exceeds. I can't remember the details of those. But we would effectively have each component as being worth 1% overall. But effectively, it was out of 7.5, and if they exceeded expectations, they'd get the 7.5. But it would be more of a sliding scale. So really, if it was in the exceeds, if it met expectations, it would be between 4 and 5.5. And if their next assignment improved on the earlier assignment, then they'd get the upper end of that spectrum. And so there would be 4 assignments, and we would basically rank it according to that. And if they improved based on the feedback that we'd provided, then their mark would go up. If they didn't, then their mark would stay at the lower end of the spectrum. So that's how we approached it there. But yeah, arguably, I haven't seen any literature. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So then a follow-up question is, you talked about having 2 different kinds of TAs in the room when they were marking the assignments. So you had, I guess, engineering TAs and then occupational therapist TAs, and it kind of sounded like you were using those 2 different viewpoints to kind of buffer the marks. So, for example, the example you gave with the engineering students, half the occupational therapists failed. I'm assuming if it was marked the other way, perhaps a larger percentage would have done a little better. And then it also sounds like over time you're using this buffering behavior even with their assignments, almost like a heterogeneity, hysteresis effect to kind of buffer their behavior over time. Is that kind of what you're shooting for?
So yeah, arguably that is effectively what we're trying to do. To be honest, for the first and second assignment, most people are just at the borderline 50%. So we are trying to ensure that we are getting both perspectives for that first assignment, just to enable them to, and mainly because they need to get that feedback, they need to understand what we're looking for. And those, usually the first 2 assignments are worth 5%. It's not worth a lot in the grand scheme of things, but it gives them that perspective. Now this year we're doing something a little bit different, and we're doing those first assignments that were originally worth 5% are now worth nothing. They're optional, and they can choose to submit, but their final report is going to be worth a lot. So if they choose to submit, they'll get that feedback, but there won't be a mark associated with it. But we're expecting the end result to be a lot better. So that is how we're trying to balance it again this year. As I'm saying, this is iterative. Every year we're trying something a little bit different based on the comments of the students, and we're kind of taking it that way. Yeah,
And
go ahead.
if I can just add to that, I think one of the challenges was the part of the assignment that the occupational therapy students were graded on actually were outside of the scope of what they were studying and what their core knowledge base was in occupational therapy. So some of it was design aspects, CAD drawings, failure modes analysis in terms of the materials. Occupational therapy students are not equipped to do that, so they were relying on their engineering student partners, but still receiving a grade for that. So if you're in a group and you have engineering students who have done a really great job with that component, you kind of get a really great grade as an occupational therapy student. But if your engineering students are not necessarily as well equipped to help you with that component, then you may get a 50, which you can't actually control. So I think that that was a big part of the challenge for us. And likewise, if you're an engineering student who within your group, your occupational therapy students do a fantastic job analyzing the human factors, which the OT students need to do in considering the performance of daily occupations and instructions for design or instructions for use of the design, then you're an engineering student who has access to a higher mark because of what your team members have done. So that's in part why we've moved to a feedback-based versus grade-based for that particular assignment. I don't know if you guys would add anything else. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we've had a very exciting conversation about undisciplining, and I hope you've taken away some very practical ideas and also some inspiration. So please join me in thanking our panelists.